hotel, then you see the road. I'm out to my soul into the size whenever the smoke clear out of my face and my picture perfect.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the second part of, What If Harry Potter Meets Twilight? Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Asian Lion Heart 310 on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. Vernon. Petunia asked her husband as the two of them were sitting side by side on comfortable seats. Yes, pet, the fat man inquired curiously while looking away from the window. Where are we going to lodge? His wife asked him with some nervousness. In a hotel at Billings, then we will take another transport to Columbia Falls. That's where we are supposed to go, Vernon asked her with a shrug before looking back at the window. I wish we were already there, Petunia lamented to herself with a sigh. At their rights, sat Harry and Dudley. One was looking through the window while the other was bored to death, grumbling something under his breath. However, he had been warned to not throw a tantrum or they will all be kicked out of the plane. Of course, the pig-like boy would annoy his cousin instead, knowing that he would get away with it, but another passenger, a Texan by the accent having enough of it, menaced both him and his parents to complain to the pilot. Vernon and Petunia instantly promised a large amount of sweets if they stayed still, which he wholeheartedly accepted. However, that didn't stop the brat for being bored. Meanwhile, Harry, after silently thanked the passenger, was currently looking outside, enjoying the trip in silence. After landing at the John F. Kennedy International Airport, the rest of the trip was mostly uneventful. In fact, once arrived on New York's ground, the Dursleys picked back their luggages and converted their monies to dollars. They decided to stay around to visit New York City. After all, in their minds and maybe yours, it would be a waste to leave so quickly after arriving, right? Anyway, the little family got to visit the city that never sleeps, as New York City was nicknamed, and most of them had enjoyed the tour so far. They got to visit many famous places such as Central Park, Times Square, Empire State Building and so on. They stayed there 4 days in total. They stayed in a hotel for the time. Petunia, being her, bought many souvenirs to bring back home while Vernon was happily taking pictures or buying food for himself and Dudley. Speaking of Dudley, the pig child totally fell in love with American food due to the fact that portions were larger than in England. In short, their first days at America were really amazing. However, a certain raven-haired boy was the only one who hated the area. For him, it was too loud and there were too many people. In his mind, it was not a place to live in. Along with that, there were no plants in this city if you don't count plant pots or Central Park. It was a place without any real form of nature. But there were also good things. During those 4 days, Harry didn't have to cook for his relatives, seeing that they mostly feed on the things they bought. The young boy could understand it, as himself had drolled more than once to the scent of American food. Sadly for him, he wasn't allowed to eat it. That or he never got any scraps to eat once his relatives were done. When he heard that it was time to leave the place, Harry was ecstatic because they will finally go to their destination and, hopefully, not linger in another crowded area. The Dursleys were not as enthusiastic because they greatly enjoyed their time in the city, but they had a reservation, so they had to leave. Later, Vernon had to buy 4 other tickets to take another flight, this time from New York to Billings Airport in Montana. It was almost a 9 hours flight. Harry, like Petunia and Dudley, weren't really thrilled by it for different reasons of course, but went along with it as they had no choice. Vernon, of course, would take pictures as souvenirs of the area they passed, and Petunia would just enjoy the ride. It was Dudley who was the less happy of the trio about all of this. Being the spoiled brat he was, he wanted either this trip to be over as quickly as possible or to have another American food to wolf down. His parents tried to reason him, but it was futile until he was promised sweets that it. Harry James Potter, him, was disappointed to not already be in Montana, but he would be a fool to not at least enjoy the trip. After all, it is every day you get to go in America unless you are a rich person at it. Sighing deeply, the raven-haired boy closed his eyes as he decided to nap for a bit only to feel someone poking him rather roughly on his side. Grunting, he used his left arm to push away whatever was poking him, and it seemed to work only for a few seconds before it started again. Starting to be annoyed, he opened his eyes to see that the annoyance was, without surprise, his cousin Dudley. "Can't you see I'm trying to sleep there?" Harry sharply inquired the obese kid, who recoiled in surprise at the reaction he got from his cousin. However, his surprise quickly turned into anger as he spat back, "You can't talk to me like that, you freak." Having enough of the brat who annoyed him to no end, Harry turned a sharp glare toward him that caused the pig-like boy to recoil in fright. This glare was filled with anger, annoyance, and coldness. "Watch me," the raven-haired boy hissed at him coldly before going back to his nap, not caring any more about his cousin. Speaking of Dudley, he was still staring at Harry with disbelief and fear on his round face. But then, he started shaking in rage before stopping. An horrible grin had grew on his face, which was sadly unseen by the napping boy, before he turned his face toward his parents. "Mom! Dad! The freak is mean to me," he whined pitifully to them as he pointed at the sleeping brat. Narrowing their eyes at the raven-haired boy and thinking that the brat was fake sleeping to look innocent, the two parents were stopped by another passenger who declared firmly. The boy did nothing but stopping this one from bothering him. By the accent, the passenger, a man in his 30s, was without a doubt from the south. Petunia and Vernon wanted to retort that there was no way Dudley would do something wrong as he was a little angel, but had to stop when many other passengers said the same. In the end, it was decided that Vernon would seat beside Harry while Dudley would be with his mother, who will hopefully DSPLN him. Much to the passengers' disgust and disbelief, Petunia, instead of lecturing her son, comforted him while giving him a chocolate bar from inside her purse. Vernon glared defiantly at the people present before turning it toward the sleeping form of his nephew. "Just you wait, freak," he grumbled softly to himself to not be heard by the closest passengers. However, one of the passengers was glaring daggers at the couple while shooting concerned glances toward where Harry was sleeping. The passenger was a young woman in her late 20s with long light brown hair and dark green eyes. She had been among the ones who defended the boy against this obese brat, as ever since she first laid her eyes on them, she had a bad feeling about the entire family minus the black-haired boy. Shaking her head, her mind went back to the outside as an expression of pure sadness and sorrow slowly appeared on her face. She didn't know it, but it won't be the last time she will see those people. 9 hours later. The flight was pretty good, but the Dursleys were overjoyed to have finally reached their destination after almost 2 days. After arriving at Billings Airport, they took a taxi to the nearest hotel where they paid for a night. Which take us to our current situation. "I'm glad we are not in this DMN plane anymore," Vernon mmm in exhaustion as he literally fell on a sofa. "And to think we are not over yet," Petunia inquired, more like whined as she sat next to him, sweating profusely. "It is almost over, pet. From what I heard, Columbia Falls is 7h from Billings tomorrow morning. I will buy a car and we will go there afterwards," Vernon explained to his wife. "Why buying a car when we can take a taxi? Didn't you see how much it cost me?" "I prefer to be the one driving," Vernon inquired with a red face as he thought back of the amount of money he had to pay for the taximan. Petunia barely had the time to nod in reluctant acceptance that something, or rather someone, caught their attention. "Mom! I'm hungry." Dudley's voice echoed as the pig-like child magically appeared in thin air in front of his parents, wailing loudly. "All right. I will call the room service," Petunia inquired gently to her beloved Duddykins as she went to one of the counter where laid a phone. At her side, her son was jumping around, excited to have some food. At the same time, Vernon was glaring down at the tiny form of his nephew, who upon seeing his uncle's gaze cowered in fright. Ever since he woke up from his nap, he had been the victim of glares and hateful looks from his uncle. Harry knew why the walrus-like man was angry, because of how harsh he had been to Dudley. Knowing the little annoyance, he had surely invented a story just to have him in trouble. And because of how stupid and spiteful they were, Petunia and Vernon surely believed him. "Boy, come here now," Vernon ordered the raven-haired child in a stern and furious tone despite how soft it was. Swallowing his fear, Harry slowly stepped closer but was growing more and more nervous at each step he took toward his large uncle, whose glare only seemed to harden as the small child stepped closer. Soon, he was standing in front of the towering figure of his uncle as the latter rose back on his feet, glaring down at him. "Yes, Uncle Vernon?" Harry asked him in a tiny voice as his emerald-green eyes looked up at him. The man didn't respond and instead, fiercely backhanded him on the cheek. The blow sent the small child on the ground and left a red trace behind. Harry whined as he was then suddenly picked up by the back of his shirt before dangling in front of the angry face of his uncle, who started yelling at him. "How dare you!" Without remorse, the large man literally threw the tiny figure to the ground, where he tumbled for a bit before laying on his stomach. "First you have the gale to bully my perfect son!" Vernon roared in anger as he kicked the child in the stomach with his boot, earning a painful grunt from his victim. "Then with your little act of fake sleeping, everyone in this DMN plane believed that Dutters was the one bothering you. My son is a perfect child, unlike you, you ungrateful brat." The walrus man snarled in anger as he approached the boy. Harry, was in pain. His side hurt like hell, and because of it, he had difficulties to get back up. The raven-haired child didn't even have the time to react when his uncle fell on him like a wave on the beach, only it wasn't water on sand but fists on flesh. "You are nothing more than a pathetic child that no one want. Your worthless parents abandoned you because you were not like them. We only took you in for the goodness of our hearts, but did you show even once a sign of thankfulness? No. You had been nothing but ungrateful to us." As he said this, Vernon repeatedly punched and kicked the boy. Harry was in a world of pain, but he wouldn't scream despite how much he wanted to. He had learned to his depend that screaming would only make things worse for him. After a minute of this, Vernon was breathing heavily in exhaustion as he stood above his victim, sweating a lot. On the ground, covered in bruises, laid Harry. He now harbored a black eye, the right one, and his nose was bleeding. He tried to stand up, but due to the pain, he fell back on the ground, whining a bit. "I hope you learned your lesson, freak." Vernon spat hatefully at the bruised boy as he picked the latter up by the collar of his oversized shirt. "Now stay in your room and no meal for you." The walrus snarled in the child's face before tossing him inside one of the 3 bedrooms. Harry barely had the time to raise his head when Vernon locked the door. Slowly and painfully, the small child made his way toward the rather large bed before climbing it. His muscles had protested rather painfully at him moving, but he ignored it in favor of climbing on the mattress. Grunting, he let himself falling on his back and was delighted by how soft and comfortable the bed was. It was as if he was laying on a cloud. Because of this and the exhaustion caused by the beating he just received, his eyes slowly closed as consciousness drifted away. Barely 10 seconds later, Harry James Potter was in the arms of Morpheus, sleeping peacefully. In the living room, sitting around a table, the Dursleys were happily feasting on the food a room service bring. Dudley was eating like life depended on it, or like a pig would. His parents were eating as well, but slower, but they sometimes glanced at their sons with either love or amusement. "Vernon, when are we going to Petunia asked her husband while shooting glance toward the room Harry was currently in. "Tomorrow," Vernon replied with a dark grin that his wife soon mirrored. "Huh? What's going on?" Dudley inquired with his mouth full as he noticed the look they sent at one another. "Nothing important, Dutters," Vernon inquired to his son in a dismissive manner. Shrugging in acceptance, the pig-like child went back to eating without a care in the world. Vernon and Petunia, after sharing a glance of amusement at their son's antic, smirked to one another. Soon the biggest pest of their life will be dealt with permanently. If only they knew what the universe had in store for them. Next day, 1 p.m. The next day, our favorite family were now comfortably seating in a yellow car Vernon rent earlier in the day. The road was clear and they hadn't met any other vehicles for a while now. The walrus was driving, his wife was at his side, while at the back, sat Dudley and Harry. They were heading to their final destination, Columbia Falls. The city was, apparently, surrounded by forests and national parks such as the Flathead National Park or the Glacier National Park. Currently, our little group was not far from the first park. It had been more than 5:30 than they left their hotel at Billings. A certain raven-haired boy had been kinda surprised when neither his uncle or aunt menaced to do anything to their little Diddykins, but he wasn't complaining. Speaking of the pig-like child, well, Dudley hadn't stopped asking his parents about, when will we be there, or, are we there yet, or even better, when are we going to eat? It was really annoying to hear this whining brat at this point. Worse was that none once did Vernon and Petunia tried anything to stop him. Instead they just answered him as if it was nothing important. In an hour or two, Diddykins. Not yet, Dudders. Soon, Popkin. That was their answers to his stupid questions about the time. For the food it was more like this. When we arrived, Diddy. That or Petunia would simply hand the obese child some chocolate bars. Don't ask where it came from, as I don't know myself, which seemed to satisfy him for the moment or until the sweet was gone and he wanted another one. Harry, wanted nothing more than to pummel his cousin, but the latter was bigger and physically stronger than him. Beside, his main attention was focused on the outside. Why? Because as our little group approached the western part of Montana, the road was surrounded by tall pines trees. Harry was mesmerized by the walls of trees around him, and from time to time, he could see animals hanging on the branches. He then saw a magnificent bird with a dark brown feathered body, a white tail, and a white head. Along with that, the bird had bright yellow eyes, a large, hooked yellow bill and powerful yellow legs and talons. Whoa, he gasped to himself as he realized he was looking at the emblem of USA, a bald eagle. The great bird, as if it had heard him, turned its white head toward him just as the car passed in front of the tree it hanged on. Their eyes locked into one another, and despite it being brief, Harry felt nothing but excitement. But soon it turned into disappointment as the bird slowly disappeared out of his sight. Sighing deeply, Harry pressed his back and head back into his seat, ignoring his cousin who was, once again, asking stupid questions to his parents. Dad! Are we there yet? Soon, Dudders, Vernon responded to his son while not looking away from the road. However, if we could see his eyes, we would see how annoyed he was. Not at his son, mind you, but of the fact they weren't arrived yet despite hours in this car. At his side, Petunia was looking at the outside with boredom. Herself wanted to be there yet, as she wasn't a strong fan of nature in general. For at least 5 minutes, silence was the only thing you could hear as none said a word. But it was quickly broken by Dudley again as he opened his mouth to ask something that even Harry didn't saw coming. Mom? Dad? Can we stop, please? Blinking, the parents turned their heads to look at their son. Well, Petunia did. Vernon used the rear-view mirror to look at Dudley. They both saw him holding his nether region with both hands while he seemed to bounce in his seat. Oh! Of course, Dudders! Vernon cried out in alarm as he parked his car on the side of the road. Quickly opening the door, Petunia instantly rushed toward her son before opening the back door to let out Dudley. The fat child literally flew out of the car, and the horse-like woman had to step aside to avoid the collision. Petunia then led him toward a bush so he could release himself, leaving behind Harry and Vernon. The raven-haired child didn't seem bothered by the fact they stopped, but what bothered him was the strange look of disgust mixed with glee Vernon sent his way. Get out of the car, the walrus man ordered him after a few seconds of silence. Harry began to say, but was interrupted by the man again, who roared forcefully. Out! Filled with fear and no wanting to anger the man, the small raven-haired child quickly opened the door before bursting outside. Vernon stepped out of the car as well, closing the door behind him before advancing toward the boy, who cowered as his uncle's shadow fell upon him. Without saying anything, Vernon grabbed the boy by the back of his shirt before punching him in the guts, knocking the air of the small boy. Harry tried to scream, but this time he received a sharp slap on the face. The poor child tumbled on the ground for at least a meter or two before stopping. As he tried to get up, his uncle slowly advanced on him with a look of contained satisfaction. "I have been waiting a long time for this, boy. We have put up with you for 2 years. No more." Vernon hissed as he kicked the boy's midsection with his right foot. Harry yelped in pain as another wave of pain passed through his body. But the pain was nothing against the terror he felt at those words. Did his uncle plan to kill him? But barely a second later, his terror turned into acceptance. Maybe death wouldn't be so bad. After he had nothing left to lose, his parents abandoned him because he was different and weak. People in England saw him as a delinquent and his relatives saw him as nothing more than a burden. Closing his eyes, he waited for the fatal blow to come, but after a minute or two, nothing. Instead, he heard footsteps, surely his aunt and cousin returning back, and then he heard the sound of closing doors. Blinking in confusion, he opened his eyes to see something that filled him, that surprised him greatly. His Uncle Vernon was walking toward the car where his aunt and cousin were already seating. From her seat, and despite being behind the window, he could clearly see the look his Aunt Petunia gave him. Her face had a dark grin on it filled with malice and happiness. This look alone filled him with dread, as his instinct was telling him that something bad was going to happen. His fears were confirmed when his walrus of an uncle said those words after opening the driver door. "May you die in those woods like the pathetic vermin you are." Harry's green eyes widened in horror as realization passed through his mind. They were going to abandon him. "And oh, please don't leave me," he cried out to them as he went back on his feet. Vernon didn't even look at him as he re-entered the car, and before the child could step any closer, the yellow car quickly moved out of its previous spot. From his seat, Dudley made a grimace toward Harry as if mocking him, but the raven-haired child was too stunned to care as his eyes followed the vehicle as it slowly turned smaller and smaller. Harry couldn't believe what just happened. The Dursleys, the only family he had, just abandoned him. They left him without any remorse. He knew they hated him, but he never thought they would do something so vile as to left to fend for himself in the woods. What about the Dursleys? Let's just say they were having a good moment. Finally. We have to deal with this freak anymore. Petunia cheered her husband before kissing him on the cheek, making sure to not distract him too much from the road. "I know, pet. Once we arrive at Columbia Falls, we are all going to the restaurant to celebrate it." Vernon inquired joyously while looking at his wife, who smiled tenderly back at him. "Yeah. But can't we go to a fast food instead?" Dudley asked his parents with an eager look on his fat face. His mood was already good when he realized they just abandoned the freak, but it went better with his father's words. "Of course. As many as you Vernon began to say to his son before his wife screamed loudly in alarm. "Watch out." A deer was standing a few meters away from the car. Seeing the animal, Vernon tried to avoid colliding with it, but because of how fast they drove, mainly to go as far away from the freak as possible, the car ended up going sideways down the road before crashing against a tree. The front part of the car was completely destroyed because of the impact, and the windows were shattered. Sadly, the car was not the only thing damaged in this accident. When they left Harry behind, none of them had their seatbelt on. The horsewoman, Petunia Dursley, was halfway through the windshield and rivers of blood streamed down the wound she got. She wasn't moving nor breathing. Her husband was no better. His head was laying on the wheel and blood could be seen falling down his forehead. For some reason, the airbags didn't work and he took the full blow of the accident. The wheel stopped him from ending up like his wife, but in the end, both were dead. What about Dudley? He wasn't in the car anymore. In fact, when the vehicle crashed against the tree, the obese boy went flying through the windshield and his lifeless body laid on the ground some meters away from the crash. A long dead silence followed the crash as nothing could be heard echoing in the air. The animals had been scared by the sound, so they without a doubt went into hiding under things were safe. But then a figure approached the smashed car. It was the same deer that almost got run over. The brown animal inspected the vehicle as if seeing if there any survivors before the sound of someone approaching caused him to run away into the forest. The someone in question was a tiny child with raven-haired boy and emerald green eyes we all love. Harry Potter's stupor broke when he heard a loud crash from where his relatives disappeared, and he went there as fast as he could. It was a difficult task because of the bruises he got from Vernon's brief beating, but he kept moving. It took him a moment before he finally reached the car, and he was shocked to find it in such a state. "Uncle Vernon? Aunt Petunia? Dudley?" he called out in a soft tone as he stepped closer. The young boy felt a small pang of sorrow when he looked inside the smashed car. All of his relatives were there and unmoving. Heck, he couldn't even hear them breathing. Harry knew that they were either unconscious or dead. And seeing the amount of blood splattered all around the inside of the car, it was clear they were not among the livings anymore. Harry was surprised to feel tears falling down his cheeks, but brushed them away with a hand. While they did abandon him, they were still family either he liked it or not. "Karma is a bee," he whispered harshly to them despite knowing that it was futile before turning his attention toward the car boot. He had heard his uncle seeing this once, and seeing the situation, it was appropriate to say it. Because of the collision with the tree, it opened and some of the Dursleys' personal objects were laying on the road. Harry picked up Dudley's backpack before filling it with some things he gathered after a few minutes of searching the car: a bit of food, tin cans, breads and some chocolate bars, a towel and some water. He even took a knife his uncle had brought this morning. He took the strict necessary. With the backpack on his back, Harry stood in front of the walls of trees. The raven-haired child decided that it wasn't a good idea to stay near the car, as scavengers will soon appear to feast on the dead bodies of his relatives. And the last thing he wanted was to face either coyotes or timber wolves. "Thank you very much." Instead, he decided to go into the forest. Sure, it was dangerous, but maybe the city was on the other side. Or at least a village of some sort. Before entering the woods, Harry looked one last time at the car and the dead bodies of his relatives. He had thought about moving them but decided against it. He wasn't strong enough to pull them out all by himself, especially his uncle. "May you be tasty enough for the scavengers," Harry whispered coldly to his relatives' lifeless bodies before facing the forest again. It seemed to call out for him for some reasons. Taking one deep breath, the raven-haired child entered the woods without once glancing back at the spot his relatives died. Instead, as he walked, Harry felt nothing but freedom. No more insults, no more beatings. He was free. Free from the Dursleys, free from a miserable life. A smile appeared on his face at those thoughts, as in his mind, things will get better from now on. As he walked, he didn't see that he was being followed. Flying above him was the bald eagle he saw earlier. The noble bird had been present since the accident and decided to keep an eye on him. Harry didn't know it, but things will turn better in the hand. Harry didn't know for how long he had been walking through a world of trees, grasses and rocks, but what even he could tell just by looking at the slowly descending sun that a few hours had passed since the accident that killed his relatives. During his walk, he had seen plenty of small animals, squirrels, birds, mice, voles, and a few rabbits. So far, he didn't see bigger creatures, but had seen prints left behind by either foxes or deers. After another long walk, the raven-haired boy stopped to take his breath. "Maybe I should look for a shelter," Harry said softly to himself as he gazed at the slowly darkening sky. He knew perfectly, thanks to the books he read on survival, that being out in the forest at night was more dangerous than during the day. Because most predators were nocturnal, such as cougars, foxes, wolves and even bears. Harry had nothing to fear from owls or bats that might live in the arena. The problem was where to shelter. There were only trees around him. Worse, there were only pine trees. While sleeping in a tree wasn't new for him once he had to when Vernon forced him to sleep outside for having better grades than Dudley, he knew that pine branches wouldn't support him. An oak tree, for example, would be perfect, or at least one with large branches and high enough to not become an animal's snack. Having a new objective, the raven-haired child instantly walked again, but this time, looked around, trying to look for a strong tree for him to sleep in or a place high enough to be out of the predator's way. As he passed, some animals looked at him from afar, either in curiosity or to determine if he was a threat or not. But then once the boy's figure disappeared, they went back to their previous occupation as if nothing had happened. Suddenly, voles, squirrels and rabbits all went into hiding when a strident screech echoed in the air. It was a bald eagle, but any eagle, it was the same one that Harry saw hours ago. It had been there when the car almost run over a deer, and the noble bird had also been there when Harry first entered the forest. It had left for a few minutes before returning back to keep an eye on the boy. Why? You will see later, happy face. However, the bald eagle will have to go back as night was slowly appearing. After all, bald eagles, like the other species of eagles all around the world, are diurnal birds and aren't made to stay out at night. But maybe someone can. Screeching one last time while memorizing where the boy was, our feathered friend flied away northwest from its current position. The magnificent bird flied for a long time but then stopped right above a wooden house standing in the middle of a hill. The two-floored house was really spacious and really cozy in appearance. The structure was built with horizontal logs interlocked at the corners by notching. The logs used for the walls were flattened on the top and bottom. A dovetail joint is cut on the end of a log, where it would rest in a corner, one to the right and one to the left, and this created a tight, interlocking corner. Inside, there were at least 6 rooms, a bathroom, a living room, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen and finally a garage. On the front part of the house, we could see a terrace. The log house was rugged and rustic, but it was welcoming. But it wasn't the house that was interesting us, it was its owner. It was a woman in her late 20s with long light brown hair and dark green eyes. Her body was pretty muscular but also not too much, and she was pretty tall, 6 feet 2 inches tall. She was also the same woman who had the misfortune of being in the same plane that a little family we all loved. The light brown-haired woman came back from New York after she went there to visit a friend of hers and was currently enjoying a bit of coffee on her terrace to enjoy the end of the afternoon when her green eyes locked on something in the sky. A fond smile grew on her face when a bald eagle landed right in front of her. Gently, she extended her left hand forward, gently caressing the magnificent bird's feathery head, who ruffled its feathers in appreciation. "Welcome back, Aspen. Did you have a good day?" she cooed affectionately to the white-headed bird. The bald eagle, whose name was apparently Aspen, screeched back at her, and the smile she harbored on her face turned into a shocked one. "An accident? Is there any survivors?" The noble bird nodded its head before screeching again. "A child? Can you describe him or her?" The bald eagle nodded again before screeching softly while shaking its head in what could be described as sorrow. The woman listened to whatever the bird was telling her, but then her eyes widened. "Wait. You said this child had black hairs and green eyes?" The bald eagle nodded its head while titling its head on the side in curiosity. Sadly for the bird, the light brown-haired woman. "Could it be?" she whispered to herself before looking back at the bird with narrowed eyes. "Describe me the child's family now." The bald eagle, seemingly surprised by the tone, quickly let out high-pitched whistling. The woman's face went stoic, but her eyes showed nothing but concern. "A walrus man, a horse woman and a pig child, there is no doubt," she grumbled to herself in anger as she remembered them pretty well. She, like many people in that plane, had been disturbed by how those people acted with one another. The fat child was nothing but a brat, and when he bothered the other boy, not once did his parents try to discipline him. Instead, the thin woman gave him chocolate. The walrus was no better. When he sat next to the fat child's victim, he hadn't stopped glaring down at him. She had seen the child when they embarked on the plane, but sadly was too far to fully take a good look at him. But it was the last thing that her feathery friend said that almost caused her to snap, about the walrus beating the poor deer and abandoning him. Her concern grew at this part as the poor deer was in the forest, alone and without a doubt injured or at least bruised. He won't last long in the woods alone, and seeing that the night was coming, his chances of survival are limited. Shaking her head to clear her thoughts, the light brown-haired woman looked back at the eagle. "Can you lead me to the crash site?" she asked the bird, who nodded its head with a small whistling. Eyes filled with determination, the light brown-haired woman swiftly went toward the garage where laid a green 4-wheel drive. She had no time to waste, she had a child to rescue. At the same time, Harry, after minutes of research, found a clearing where, in the middle of it, stood a majestic cedar tree. It was the biggest one he had seen and he couldn't help but looking at it with wide eyes of amazement. He silently wondered how this cedar tree came here. But then he flinched when he heard growls echoing from behind him and, gulping slightly in nervousness, he slowly turned around only to come face to face with a pack of timber wolves. Known as one of the largest subspecies of wolves and one of the longest, timber wolves was among the apex predators you can find in America alongside bears brown or black, cougars, bobcats and wolverines. What were they doing here? Simple, as the night was slowly approaching, the wolves went out to hunt the poor animals who had the misfortune to be in their paths. Unfortunately, Harry had unconsciously entered their hunting grounds. Damn it! It had to be wolves, the raven-haired child inquired in a soft tone as his green eyes went back and forth between the 8 wolves in front of him. He wasn't a dog person at all. In fact, he grew to dislike them a lot as dogs reminded him of Sirius Orion Black, whose animagus form was a black dog. Before being abandoned to the Dursleys, he loved his godfather, but now things had changed. Sirius had left him, or so he thought, to hell on heart. While he could understand, it still pained him. As for the wolves, it reminded him of Remus Lupin, one of his father's friend and a werewolf. He was kind to the raven-haired child, but Harry remembered very well how reluctant he wanted to play with him when he was younger. Now that he remembered it, Remus would only accept to play with him when Sirius was present or when William wanted him to join them. Back to present, Harry slowly backed away from the growling and snarling canines while thinking about how to get out of this situation. Sure, he had the knife he borrowed from the Dursleys, but it would not be enough against 8 wolves at once. But then he remembered something. Just behind him, there was a tree, and wolves can't climb trees, right? After all, dogs don't climb them. The cedar was his only chance, and he could use the knife when one of the canines was too close to his liking. Now he only had to find a way to distract them from him. As if someone whispered into his ears, an idea formed into his young mind. The backpack. Pulling out the bag from his back, Harry quickly but secretly pulled out the knife before tossing the bag toward the pack. It landed right in front of a rather big gray wolf who growled at the strange object in front of it. But then a strange smell reached its nostril, and soon, the wolf started to tear the backpack. The gray wolf must have been an alpha, because as soon as it started to focus on the bag, the other wolves joined it. Soon their whole attention was focused on the backpack, completely ignoring Harry, who sighed in relief that his plan worked. However, he had to be quick, so without wasting more time, the young child started to climb the cedar tree. It wasn't the first time he climbed in a tree, so he knew how to it properly, finding the right branches to step on, having your fingers find the right grip, and the most important rule, never looking down. After all, he had climbed trees to escape Dudley and his clowns back in England many times, knowing that his dear cousin was too far to ever climb the tree. Ignoring the growls and snarls from the wolves tearing down his backpack, the young boy kept climbing the tree, but sadly for him, when he was barely 3 meters high from the ground, that one of the wolves turned its head away from the bag to stare at him with its pale yellow eyes. The canine instantly charged with bared teeth, and once it reached the tree's base, the canine jumped as high as it could. Wolves may not be climbers, but they were jumpers. The wolf's jaws almost got Harry's right foot before he landed back on the ground, growling in disappointment to have caught its prey. The other wolves, having lost interest in the backpack or what remained of it, started to surround the tree, looking up at the raven-haired child with hunger as the latter climbed higher in the tree. Harry stopped his ascension after another minute and was now sitting on a branch, looking down at the wolves whose eyes were locked on him. Some of them were even laying down on their stomachs. Wolves were intelligent creatures, but also really patient. They knew that Harry will have to come down sooner or later. They only have to wait for their meal to fall right in their jaws. The raven-haired child's eyes fell on his backpack and was a bit sad at having his food and stuff scattered around or destroyed thanks to the wolves. Because of this, he had one more reason to dislike them as much as he understand how hungry they must be. When his eyes landed back on the hungry pack, Harry wondered how long it would take before they lost interest in him. Now he was regretting even entering this forest. Meanwhile, a green four-wheel drive stopped right in front of the destroyed vehicle of the Dursleys. Stepping out of it was the still unnamed light brown-haired woman who looked at the scene in shock. After all, it wasn't every day you came upon such a sight. Shaking her head to focus back on the reason of her presence here, she turned her head toward the bald eagle who had landed on her car. "Thank you, girl, you can go back home now. I can take it from here," she inquired affectionately to her feathered friend, who released a couple of piping notes before flying away from there, screeching loudly to announce her departure. The still unnamed woman watched her friend flying away before looking back at the destroyed car. Looking around to make sure that no one was watching, she closed her eyes for a few seconds while smelling the air. When she reopened her eyes, they weren't human-like anymore but more feral because of how dilated her irises were. "I got you now," a deep feminine voice escaped the woman's lips as her entire body started to pulsate. It was as if something was shifting inside her. Her muscles started to bulges and harden as light brown fur appeared on her skin. The woman fell on her hands as her body seemed to grow in size and her clothes seemed to melt into her skin. Soon, thick round ears formed at the top of her slowly turning broadening head as claws replaced her sails. On her face, a large muzzle sprouted from it along with sharp teeth. Her hands and feet turned into large clawed paws. Lastly, from her pelvis grew a tiny tail. Where a young woman in her late 20s stood a few seconds ago, was now a massive brown bear. The ursine stood at least 7 foot tall on its 4 legs. But when the massive mammal got up to stand on its hind legs, it now 15 feet tall. The gigantic woman turned brown bear sniffed the air again and soon went back on her paws as she dashed deeper into the forest. In her mind, she couldn't stop thinking about the young boy she came for. "Hold on, kiddo, I'm coming," she growled to herself as her massive form went through the woods. At the same time, Harry was still perched in his tree, looking down at the wolves who hadn't moved much from their spots around the tree base. "Can't you go look for something else?" "I'm too thin for you," the raven-haired boy hissed at the wolves, and some of them snarled or growled at him in response. One of them though licked its chops while looking up at him. Harry sighed deeply before looking up at the sky. Night will be there in a moment and he didn't know how long he could stay like this. If he dares to sleep, he might accidentally fall from the branch and right to the wolves. "Is this how I die?" As a chew toy for wolves, the raven-haired child whispered to himself as he looked down at the ground in slight defeat. But then he shook his head as a fierce look soon appeared on his face. "No, if I have to die, at least it will be honorable even if no one's watching," Harry declared to himself as he pulled out his knife. Then he looked down at the wolves whose attention was still on him. However, when he revealed his knife, some of the canines growled at him. Harry took one deep breath before jumping. The small child landed right on the back of a large gray and white wolf who howled in surprise at the unexpected weight on its back. Once the surprise was over, the canine growled as it tried to dislodge the intruder by shaking its body, but Harry had a firm grip on its fur. The raven-haired boy grunted as he raised a hand, the one holding the knife, before descending it with a battle cry. The other wolves, at first stunned by the sudden attack, had charged forward to help their pack mate only to stop when the wolf in question yipped in pain. After a second, it fell on the ground before laying there, unmoving. Harry then pushed himself away from the dead body before going back on his feet. His green eyes looked back and forth between the lifeless wolf and the blood-covered knife in his right hand, his face showing nothing but disbelief by the fact he managed to kill a full-grown wolf. The wolves looked just as stunned, but then they growled again as their eyes locked once again on the human boy. Their prey wasn't as weak as he looked, meaning this hunt will not be so easy. The canines were now cautious of the raven-haired child as they started to surround him to prevent their prey to escape, not that Harry planned to. In fact, the thin boy looked ready to defend himself, his bloody weapon shining slightly in preparation. He waited for one of them to attack him. While he knew they could easily kill him, he didn't care. He had lived as a weak boy for too long. No more. This time he will fight. For a moment, the two parties stared at one another, wondering who will make the first move, as we could hear nothing but silence, as if the whole forest had stopped breathing. But then, they heard it, footsteps, heavy ones at that. Harry's bravado fell a bit at the sound. Whatever was approaching was without a doubt much bigger than the wolves currently surrounding him. Speaking of the wolves, their attention was no more on the boy who killed one of their own but on whatever was approaching. Of the 7 remaining canines, 3 of them had their ears lowered down in slight fear. Regardless, all of them had their teeth bared, ready to confront whoever was heading their way, while Harry also readied his knife. For a minute, the footsteps kept coming closer, becoming heavier and heavier by the seconds. Some of the wolves looked less motivated in facing this foe, and even Harry glanced at his knife with worry. Then the footsteps miraculously stopped and silence followed. A large grey wolf, the alpha, took a step forward, baring its teeth in challenge. Behind it, 3 of its packmates whimpered in fright while the others growled or snarled at something. A guttural growl then echoed in the air, answering the alpha's challenge before a massive shape appeared in the clearing. Harry's eyes bulged in shock. It was the biggest bear he had never seen. The wolves backed away from their gigantic foe, their ears against their skulls to clearly show their fear of it. Annoying mutts. Get out of here. Harry heard a deep feminine voice echoing, and he quickly realized that it came from the gigantic bear. As growled this, the large brown bear had taken another big step forward, and Harry could swear he felt the ground shaking slightly before swiping the ground with her right forepaw. The action caused some wolves to whimper in fear, but because their alpha was still there, they stayed even if their ears were still pressed against their skulls. I said get lost. The brown bear roared to the wolves while standing on her back legs. The roar along with their foe's appearance was enough to scare even the alpha, who was the first one to leave the clearing with its tail between its legs. His pack soon followed, no wanting to stay near the gigantic bear. Once the wolves were gone, the massive ursine fell back on all 4, huffing loudly in satisfaction. DMN wolves now, are you alright little dash, she grumbled to herself before turning her large head toward a certain raven-haired boy whose emerald eyes were locked on her. Her question froze when her eyes locked with his. This little one got the most gorgeous green eyes she had ever seen. They seemed to shine like pure emeralds. Then she took in another details, the dead wolf at his feet and the BLD-covered knife in his hand. Putting 2 and 2 together, she looked at the tiny child with amazement. But after realizing that she was staring, which was impolite, she shook her large head before focusing back on the reason of her presence here. Are you okay, kiddo? She asked him in a gentle tone despite how deep it was. However, she quickly wanted to slap herself. Of course he cannot understand her. But then to her shock, the raven-haired child opened his mouth to say, I'm fine, miss. Swiftly, the gigantic brown bear's head turned back toward the child, who seemed surprised by such a quick action as he yelped in surprise. You understand me? She asked him with disbelief, but her dark green eyes shining with curiosity. Why yes, Harry inquired shyly as he looked down at the ground, finding it pretty interesting all of a sudden. The brown bear had to admit that he was pretty cute and couldn't help but smiling fondly at the raven-haired child in front of her. Sitting on her rear, she gently used her forepaws to pick up the tiny boy, who squeaked in surprise before carefully holding him as if he was a newborn baby. Now she got a good look at him. She had to say that he was a really cute kid, albeit too thin to her liking. And his clothes looked much too big for him. But his most striking features were his eyes. In her mind, this little one will become a handsome young man in the future. Harry, who had started to struggle, soon calmed down when the large bear rocked him back and forth, shushing him gently. Don't be scared, little one, I won't hurt you, she inquired in a maternal tone as she looked down at him. Harry shyly hid his face behind his hands, not used to being talked like this. The she-bear, seeing this, growled in amusement before her expression turned serious again. Little one, where's your family? She knew the answer but wanted to hear it from him. The raven-haired boy hesitated for a second, but after seeing the caring look in her dark green eyes, he felt like he could trust her, so he opened his mouth to say in a soft tone. They are dead, killed in a car crash. Nodding her large head, the she-bear then inquired him gently, wanting more answers. What about your parents? The gigantic she-bear was a bit taken aback by the anger shining in those emerald green eyes of his before it turned into sorrow. They abandoned me, he answered in a pained tone which broke the bear's heart. Aw, you poor thing, she cooed at him in sympathy as she lowered her head down to gently nuzzle his face in an attempt to comfort him. Harry, touched by how caring this bear was, instinctively hugged her muzzle, which almost caused her heart to stop beating because of how cute this gesture was. Giggling, the she-bear slightly opened her mouth to lick his right cheek, eliciting a yelp of surprise from the tiny boy in her forepaws, or should I say arms. This action caused her to smile down at him tenderly. He was just too cute. Then her mind went back to something else. Sweetie, since when can you talk to bears? She asked him in a curious tone. I don't know, I discovered it during a trip at the zoo 2 years ago with my fammy dash, Harry began to say before stopping as a flash of pain passed in his eyes. I see, anything else? She asked with softly while giving him another big lick on the cheek. Well, the old bear at the zoo said I was marked, but he didn't have the time to tell me more, Harry inquired after a few seconds of thoughts. Frowning, the she-bear pulled her head away from the tiny boy in her paws to inspect him. Her dark green eyes scanned his whole body before landing on his birthmark. Seeing it, her eyes widened in shock. By the great bear, she whispered to herself, but the little one in her forepaws heard her. What? Are you okay? Harry asked her with some concern. The fact he cared for her well-being despite having met her only a few moments ago was both cute and adorable. She gave him a gently lick at the top of his head for this, and he whined a bit at having saliva again on his face, amusing her a bit. I'm fine, little one, now I think I should take you home, she inquired him gently while carefully putting him down. Harry titled his head at her with surprise at those words. Why? Because I would be heartless to let such a cute little one alone in those woods. The she-bear responded with a gentle but firm tone. Harry, once again, was touched by the attention as he looked at the brown bear, who was now crouched down on the ground, laying on stomach. Climb on, little one. I will carry you. She inquired him gently. Really? Harry asked her with excitement clear in his voice and eyes. The large brown bear laughed in amusement at the child's excitement, as it was extremely cute, but nodded her head. Of course. Now come on, the train is ready to leave, she joked at him, and he giggled a bit before carefully climbing her. The she-bear patiently waited for him to be positioned before going back on her paws. Once she felt him sitting right behind the hump of her back, she asked him. Ready, little one? Yes. His little cry caused her to smile in amusement as she slowly went back on her paws before heading toward where her car was. As she walked through the woods with her precious cargo, she blinked. She didn't ask for his name. Wanting to slap herself for forgetting such an easy question, the she-bear decided to rectify this by asking. Little one, what is your name? Harry, the raven-haired child responded from his spot. No surname. I don't want to use it, was his response. Understanding the reason, the she-bear gave him a look of sympathy before looking back forward. For a few minutes, they walked in silence, but it was interrupted by Harry, who opened his mouth to ask in a soft tone filled with childish curiosity. What is your name, miss? Smiling, the brown bear gave him a sideway glance to answer gently. Astrid Anderson. How come you have a surname? Harry asked her curiously while frowning in confusion. After all, only humans had surnames, not animals. I will explain once we are at my car, was her cryptic answer. Despite his growing confusion and curiosity, Harry decided to wait and see while enjoying the ride. Time skip. It took them almost 30 minutes to reach the road, and the sky was now dark as the moon shining in all its glory. Still laying on the gigantic bear's back, Harry looked toward the destroyed car of his relatives with an expression of indifference. Astrid noticed it but didn't say anything as she walked toward her green four-wheel drive. You can climb down now, dear, she inquired him gently. Blinking, the raven-haired child carefully did what he was told, and once his feet touched the hard ground of the road, he turned his emerald green eyes toward the bear. "What now, miss?" he asked her with titled head. Astrid smiled down at him in response but said nothing. As she closed her eyes. At first, he thought she was sleeping, but then, she started to shrink. The light brown fur covered her body slowly went back into her skin as her clawed paws turned into hands and feet. Her muzzle turned into a humanoid face and the round ears at the top of her head disappeared. Harry's eyes were wide in shock as she watched the large she-bear becoming a tall woman with some muscles. Her hairs were light brown, and when she reopened her eyes, they were dark green. For a few seconds, there was only silence as Harry's mind was still processing what he just saw. "Miss Astrid?" he asked her tentatively. "Yes, dear," the light brown-haired woman answered in a gentle tone as she looked down at him with nothing but affection. "How can you dash?" Harry began to ask with curiosity, only to be shushed by the pretty woman. "Later, dear, let's take you home," Astrid whispered motherly to him as she caressing his cheek with a hand. The raven-haired boy looked into her eyes and nodded in response. She smiled as she picked him up before approaching her vehicle. The light brown-haired woman placed Harry at the back before climbing on the driver's seat. After making sure that Harry had his seatbelt on, Astrid started the car before driving away from there. The raven-haired child looked at his savior as his little mind was filled with unanswered questions, but as he opened his mouth to ask them, a cute yawn escaped his lips instead. Hearing this, Astrid giggled a bit before inquiring in a maternal tone, "You are free to take a small nap, dear, if you want." "I'm not yawn-tired," he tried to protest, only for another yawn to escape his mouth. "For some reason I don't believe you, little one," Astrid commented with a smirk of triumph. Pouting slightly, Harry tried to fight against his exhaustion. The adrenaline he felt with the wolves and what happened afterwards was gone, but in the end, had to accept defeat as he slowly fell asleep. A small giggle escaped Astrid's lips as she looked at him through the rear-view mirror. "Sleep well, little one," she whispered gently to him before focusing back on the road, heading back to her home, but this time with a special little guest. The next day, 8 a.m. A groan escaped his throat as sunlight caressed his face. Slowly waking up from his slumber, the young child opened his mouth to release a soft yawn. The first thing Harry noticed once he woke up was the wooden ceiling. Blinking a few times, the raven-haired 6-year-old child slowly turned his little head around to inspect his surrounding. He was in a rather big bedroom. The walls were made of the same wood at the ceiling, but he had to admit that the room was cozy. At his right side, there was a wardrobe, and to his left, a dresser. Once he took in the place, he looked down at himself. He was no longer wearing the large clothes of the day prior. Instead, he didn't know how, but he had a pair of blue pajamas on him. Surprisingly, they fitted him perfectly. For a few seconds, Harry wondered how he got those and how did he got in this room before he remembered what happened the previous night. The hungry wolves. Him using his backpack to bait the canines while he climbed the cedar tree. Him jumping up a tree and killing one of the wolves. The arrival of the gigantic brown bear. At the souvenir of the Ursine, Harry blinked a few times as he remembered how gentle she was with him despite having only met him. But what he remembered the most was how she turned into a human. He had never heard about people turning into bears before. Sure, he knew about werewolves, but were bears? This fact alone made him curious of her. However, his thoughts were quickly interrupted by a delicious smell. As if hypnotized, the raven-haired boy quickly left the medium-sized bed he had been sleeping on before leaving the bedroom to where this divine smell came from. After almost a minute, he reached another part of the wooden house, the kitchen. He froze on the spot when he heard someone humming from inside. Peeping in, Harry saw that the someone in question was none other than the pretty lady who was so gentle with him yesterday. Unaware of his presence, her back was turned to him, so he was unable to see her face, but he could clearly see that she had light brown hair that reached the middle of her back. Like he had noticed the night prior before falling asleep, she was indeed really tall and rather muscular for a woman. Thankfully, not enough to be mistaken as a man. But then his attention went to what she was making, a plate of pancakes, some bacons and eggs and French toasts. Harry couldn't help himself as his mouth watered at the sight, but then a small voice in his head was telling him that this breakfast was probably making for herself and not for him. Thankfully he had been proven wrong not long after. Indeed, as he seemed to be entirely focused on the food, Astrid had turned around to pick up something in the fridge only to stop dead in her track when she saw who was at the kitchen's entrance. Seeing his little mouth watering at the food, she couldn't retain herself for giggling in amusement. "Hello there, sleepyhead," she greeted him with a smile as she came closer to him. Her voice seemed to wake him up from his little trance, and Harry found himself blushing madly at being caught in the act. Tapping his little fingers together, he turned his head away in embarrassment. "Hi Miss Astrid," he answered back in a really small voice. Astrid giggled in amusement at the sight of his blushing face while finding him really cute at the moment as she bent down to ruffle his raven hairs in an affectionate manner, causing him to whine slightly. Still smiling, the light brown-haired woman gently pushed him toward the front doors, and for a second, Harry thought that she was kicking him out. To his surprise, once she opened the door, he saw a terrace where a little white round table standing there along with 2 chairs. Surrounding the terrace was surrounded by a wooden fence. But that wasn't what caught his attention. Harry's eyes shined with amazement as he took in the sight at the other side of the terrace. Around him, there was nothing but grasses, trees, and he could even see a flowing river not too far. Then fairer, in the background, he could see high mountains. Seeing his face, Astrid gave him a fond smile but then putted a hand on his right shoulder, catching his attention. "Go on and seat, little one, I will bring you breakfast," she inquired him gently. Harry looked at her with wide eyes of shock, his emerald green eyes sparkling with disbelief as they looked at her darker eyes. "Really? I get food?" he asked her eagerly but also with surprise, as if it was totally something new for him. Astrid froze at those words as she couldn't help but sighing with sympathy. The night before, once she returned home, the brown-haired woman had taken his sleeping form to the bathroom to at least change him. However, the second she pulled out the oversized shirt off him, she had been greeted by a sight she will never forget. His tiny body was covered with scars of all sizes, and she could count his ribs because of how skinny he was. Worse, some of those scars looked infected. Did he never went to a doctor before? Astrid had realized with anger and little surprise that the little one had been clearly abused. The scars, his tiny frame, there was no doubt. Of course, she had taken care of the scars as best as she could before putting him in the second room. Now she had another confirmation of his mistreatment. With those people. No wonder he was so skinny, he had been denied food. Shaking her head to get rid of those dark thoughts, she shot him a small smile before inquiring gently. "Of course, dear. You clearly need it after all." Once she said this, she teased him by tickling his ribs, earning a little giggle from the tiny boy. The sound of it warmed her heart and promised to herself to make him laugh more often. Looking at him one more time, the brown-haired woman went back into the house to pick up the plates before heading back inside. Harry's attention was entirely on the gorgeous view of the nature surrounding the house. "Little one, here is your breakfast," Astrid called out gently, breaking him out of his reverie. "Thank you, Miss Astrid," he thanked her gently before looking back at the food, hesitating about what to take. Seeing this, the brown-haired woman silently cursed those people for what they did to this cute little one before smiling as she prepared his plate: 2 eggs, 3 pieces of bacons, and a little plate of pancakes with syrup on it. Harry's eyes widened at the amount of food he was given. He never good so much before, especially with the Dursleys, and once again shyly thanked the kind woman. "Aw, it's nothing, sweetie. Now dig in before it get cold," Astrid inquired him with a soft comforting smile, which he timidly returned before slowly eating the food in front of him. The brown-haired woman smiled at him before slowly enjoying her own breakfast. The two ate mostly in silence except for the times Astrid had to inquire Harry to eat slower, and soon there were nothing left. A little burp escaped Harry's mouth once he finished his breakfast, and he quickly blushed in embarrassment. "Sorry," he whispered softly to the kind woman in front of him. "It's okay, dear," she replied with a giggle before asking with a gentle smile. "Did you enjoy your meal?" Hum, it was yummy," Harry nodded with a tiny smile of his own. "I'm glad to hear that, sweetheart," Astrid inquired in appreciation to his comment as she picked up the plates to wash them. "Do you want some help, Miss Astrid?" Harry inquired him almost instinctively when he saw her picking the plates. The brown-haired woman smiled at him, but internally she was conflicted. His longing to help was cute, but it had clearly been beaten into him. "No thank you dear, I think I can manage on my own for now, but thank you for asking," Astrid answered him affectionately before entering the house, leaving him behind. Harry watched her go before turning his eyes back to the outside. But then he heard a strident screech and he blinked as he looked at the sky. A gasp of excitement, delight and shock escaped his throat when he saw a bald eagle approaching the house. Releasing another strident screech, the magnificent bird descended toward him and Harry had to back away when it landed right in front of him, using the fence as a perch. For a moment, nothing was heard as the child and the eagle looked at one another in the eyes. When the former tilted his head to one side, the latter would mimic him. "I see you met Aspen," Astrid's voice echoed after a few minutes with what sounded like amusement in her tone. Turning away from the majestic bird of prey, Harry looked up at the brown-haired woman approached them. The young boy watched with amazement as she extended an arm toward the bird before caressing its head. "You can caress her too, little one, if you want," the woman softly inquired to him as she caressed the bird. Gulping in nervousness, the tiny boy slowly approached the bald eagle, Aspen as Miss Astrid called her, whose yellow eyes landed on him once again. Astrid pulled her hand away to watch the scene with a smile on her face. Timidly, Harry slowly reached forward for the bird who tilted her head to the right in curiosity as she eyed his hand. But a few seconds later, Aspen lowered her head down, allowing him to touch her. Harry was amazed by how soft her feathers were as he gently caressed them with his fingers. His eyes shined brighter in delight as the bird released a small pleased sound. Astrid, for her part, clapped her hands in delight at the scene. "It seems, my dear, that you get a new friend," she cooed at him with an amused raisebrow. Harry blushed slightly at the remark, but his whole attention was on the bald eagle, who he had stopped caressing at this point, as he whispered softly, "She is so pretty." The magnificent bird proudly ruffled her feathers, clearly appreciating the praise while Astrid rolled her eyes in fond annoyance, muttering softly, "Great, you stroked her ego." Aspen screeched at her for that and the brown-haired woman shot her friend a smirk before adding while eyeing a curious Harry, "But yes, she is." The bald eagle firmly nodded her head before looking at her with piercing eyes while released some piping notes. Astrid's playful face fell a little as she stared at the magnificent bird straight in the eyes. After a few seconds, a loud screech left Aspen's beak as if angered about something, and the cry caused Harry to back away in slight fear. Seeing it, the bald eagle turned her head toward the child with a look of apology in her yellow eyes. "She says she is sorry for scaring you, dear," Astrid translated while seating back on one of the chairs with her legs crossed. The raven-haired child looked back and forth between the nice woman and the gorgeous bird of prey, clear confusion written on his face. "How can you understand her, Miss Astrid?" he asked the brown-haired woman with childish curiosity. Astrid and Aspen looked back at one another for a moment before they both looked back at the curious child who was still patiently waiting for an answer. "Aspen here is my familiar, dear," the brown-haired woman responded with a smile as she reached out to slide Aspen's brown feathers. "What is a familiar?" Harry asked her, still confused. "Well, familiars, sweetheart, are, in short, companions. They can be used as messengers, spies, or simply as guides," Astrid explained in a calm tone, still caressing the bald eagle's feathers. "Ooh!" Harry awed with shiny eyes making him look even cuter. The brown-haired woman smiled fondly at the curious boy before saying gently, "I'm sure one day you will get a familiar of your own." "But how do someone get a familiar?" the raven-haired 6-year-old boy asked her with his head tilted to the side. "Well, I met Aspen when I was 16 years old. She was injured when I found her. I took care of her, and when it was the time for her to leave, she decided to stay. The second we touched again, I felt like something was mixing with my very soul. When I asked my father about it, he said we have formed a contract for lack of better terms." Astrid paused in her explanation to look down at Harry, whose face was showing nothing but amazement. Amused by his cute expression, the brown-haired woman glanced briefly at Aspen, who was cleaning her feathers at this point with her beak, before resuming. "Me and Aspen are linked, and that's why we can understand each other. We can even speak telepathically." Whoa! Harry gasped with stars in his eyes as he looked back and forth between her and the bird. Aspen ruffled her feathers with pride as she seemed to enjoy the attention she was receiving from the tiny human, while Astrid couldn't retain herself from awing at how cute he looked at the moment. My father had a crow familiar. He met him during a hunt, the brown-haired woman inquired after a second or two. Did he have to save his familiar too? No. Apparently, when their eyes met, he felt the same thing that me, and he understood that this bird was his familiar. Harry then went deep in thought as his little mind processed what he just heard. You will understand once you discover your familiar, little one, but you are a bit young for that though, Astrid inquired comfortingly before going softer at the last part. Harry asked her with confusion and curiosity. Forget what I said, I just remembered something. Astrid dismissed him with a wave of her hand, and he nodded his head in acceptance. So any animals can be a familiar? Harry asked her to change the subject. Of course. You can even have a bear familiar. But it is rare, the brown-haired woman answered to him. How come? Well, mostly because bears tend to hide from any humans. Harry nodded in understanding. Bears are solitary animals and were wary of humans. Though it would be great to have a bear as companion. Especially when he literally can speak to bears in general. Do you have more questions, sweetie? Astrid asked him calmly while internally knowing that he had questions. Yes, how can you turn into a bear, Miss Astrid? Harry asked her with interest shining in those emerald green eyes of his. The brown-haired woman seemed to hesitate as if she was debating on either or not she should answer. Aspen, for her part, shot her a piercing look, and after a few seconds of silence, Astrid sighed deeply. Very well, but before I answer, dear, you must promise to not repeat anything I'm about to tell you, understood? The brown-haired woman demanded in a stern tone. Harry quickly nodded, no wanting to anger her. Astrid calmed down quickly before she shot him an apologetic look. Forgive me, sweetheart, but it had to be done. It's okay, the raven-haired child inquired in a really soft tone. He was a bit scared of her now. Frowning, the brown-haired woman thought about how to cheer him up a bit when an idea came into her mind. Sweetie, she called out in a soft tone. Harry slowly looked at her and seemed to relax a bit at the sight of her maternal smile, and her eyes filled with warmth. Come here, she inquired him gently as she slowly spread her arms. Harry slowly climbed down his chair before approaching her. When he was close enough, Astrid gently picked him up before pulling him against her chest with his little head against her melon cup. If you want to know. He could feel her arms enveloping him into a gentle and comforting hug. Harry felt something he never felt for a long time, peace. The last time he received a hug was from his brother William after the incident of the zoo 2 years ago. Lily had never given him hugs except when she did remembered him, but they were forced and without a lot of genuine love. But this woman, who he had met just the previous night, showed him more care than his own parents. The feeling of safety was also something he missed. At the Dursleys, he always had to look above his shoulders in case Dudley or something else attacked him. Astrid's presence radiated nothing but love, care and protection, and he liked it. He liked it a lot. Slowly, he pulled himself closer against her before wrapping his tiny arms around her waist. Astrid, who had felt it, tightened her grip on him and even gave him a small kiss on the forehead, which caused him to squeak more in surprise than in embarrassment. Comfy, dear? The brown-haired woman asked him teasingly. Yes, Miss Astrid, Harry responded in a tiny tone as he buried his face into her to hide his face. I'm glad to hear that, dearie. Astrid kissed him again on the forehead before adding. As for your question, well, I'm a daughter of the Great Bear. What? Harry asked with confusion. Well then, it all started with Callisto, Astrid began to say back in a serious but calm tone before she was interrupted by the boy in her arms. Wasn't she the nymph who got turned into a bear by the goddess Artemis? The raven-haired child responded in an hesitant tone. Exactly. How do you know that, little one? She asked him with curiosity. I read it in a book, Harry admitted shyly while burying his face against her belly. Is that so? So you must know about her later becoming the Great Bear constellation after she had almost been killed by her son Arcus? Astrid asked him with a raised brow. She felt him nodding his tiny head. Good then. Astrid squealed in delight but then turned serious again as she opened her mouth to say. If I asked you this it was because I wanted to know if you knew this constellation. Harry nodded in understanding and was now looking up at her with curiosity shining in his eyes. Everything started in Norway with a couple who was unable to have children. They tried everything, called every healers, but nothing could be done for them as both were unfertile. Aw, that's sad, Harry commented softly, and she ruffled his hair in response. Yes, it is anyway. Despaired as they wanted to be parents, they prayed the gods for help. The Norse gods, right? Seeing that they are in Norway, Harry inquired with a titled head. That's right, but they were so despaired that they didn't care which gods answered them as long as they could have what they always wanted. The raven-haired child nodded his head in understanding before going silent again. For days they prayed fervently, but after weeks of silence, they gave up hope until one night, when someone from the stars visited them. Who? Harry asked her with curiosity. It wasn't a god but an ancient spirit. It was the Great Bear, Callisto herself. But she was not from the Norse pantheon. Harry replied with confusion and disbelief. I know, but she is not a goddess. She became a constellation and part of the very sky. Even when the Greek civilization disappeared, the gods still existed and those associated with them. Silent, Harry nodded his head in response. Anyway, Callisto was the only one who answered the call. No one know why she came though, but in the end, in order to help them to conceive a child, she temporarily possessed the woman's body. Astrid paused in her story as she looked at the wide-eyed child. Smiling, she took a deep breath before resuming. 9 months later, the couple gave birth to twins. Bjorn and Ursa. The other villagers were shocked by this turn of events and banished the whole family. But why? Harry asked her with a bit of anger and sympathy for the little family. Because one day, the 2 infants turned into bear cubs. It was the side effect of Callisto's blessing. Their children were half human, half bears. Seen as abominations, they were exiled from the village along with those who supported them. Harry stayed silent as he let Astrid speaking. They walked for a long time, and each time they passed near a village, they would be kicked out, not because of the infants but because they couldn't more mouths to feed. In the end, they had no choice but to live as nomads. The raven-haired child felt sympathetic toward the exiled people as they didn't deserve to be kicked out of their home. He could relate to them in that regard. Abandoned by his parents because he was different. As the time passed, more and more werebears appeared thanks to the twins, and to never forget the place they were born, they decided that only Norse names could be given to their descendants anyway. Many years later, they tried to establish in Europe, and for a time, they lived in peace until they were discovered by the church. Harry couldn't help but feeling like something bad was going to be said. And he wasn't disappointed. The werebears of Europe were hunted and nearly driven to extinction if the survivors hadn't left to the west. Harry could hear the anger in her tone as she mentioned this part but stayed silent. The leader at that time, a strong man named Ragnar Thorsten, received a vision from Callisto about a world where they could live in peace, a country without discrimination. All they had to do was to traverse the Atlantic, which they did. A look of sorrow briefly appeared on Astrid's face as she said, not all of them managed to reach this new country. Harry gave her a comforting hug and she gave him a soft smile of appreciation in response. After many weeks, they finally an area who will later be called Newfoundland, and slowly the werebears started to spread all around Canada and USA. Her expression turned grim as if she was remembered something. Of course, we had some competitions with the locals, but they were mostly accepting of us except for a little group who had the ability to turn into giant wolves. They tried to kick us out of their territory, but in the end, we won and they fled more to the west after the battle. A treaty was made with them, and since then, we didn't have any conflicts with those mangy drooling mutts. She really hated wolves and he couldn't blame her. Decades passed and another type of enemy came to America, vampires. They exists. Harry blurted in shock. Yes dear, they are strong, durable creatures with pale skins and a strong taste for blood. Werebears had battles with them with many losses. Why? Harry asked her with a frown. We are not quick enough against them. The wolves, while not as strong as us, were agile and fast. They were equals with the vampires. We, on the other end, were more like punching ball for them. Astrid seemed a bit angry at this part but then relaxed as a smirk grew on her face. But then Callisto came to our help to be able to be on par with those leeches. The Great Bear blessed us with a new form. What new form? Harry asked her with a frown. Smirking at him, she gently putted him down before jumping at the other side of the fence. Curious, Harry watched as she glanced around as if making sure that no one was watching before her body changed in front of his very eyes. He watched with stupor when a few seconds later, Astrid became an humanoid bear. At least 3 meters tall, the creature had the head, fur and claws of a bear but the physical of a human. Its feet were bare paws. Her melons were covered in fur as well and was no longer hidden by a BR. In fact, her clothes seemed to have melted into her skin when she transformed. Along with that, her arms were really big, clearly filled with muscles and, if he was a little older, he would have noticed how curved she was. Harry looked up at her with stars in his eyes which caused the humanoid bear to chuckle a bit as Astrid returned to human form with clothes on. Returning back to her previous spot, the brown-haired woman sat back on the chair. With this form of ours, warbears could oppose vampires and win against them. Since then, those leeches tried to avoid us as best as they could. What about the werewolves? European werewolves or lycans tend to fear us and they aren't that many here in America. They usually get killed by either a werbear or a wolf shifter. Harry nodded at her in response before asking, so you are a werbear? Indeed I am, little one, and proud of it, Astrid replied with an eye-closed smile. I wish I could be one too, the raven-haired child whispered softly to himself as he looked at his feet. Astrid looked at him with pity before pulling him into a comforting embrace. Maybe you will one day, sweetheart. Really? He asked her with a hopeful expression. Really? Astrid responded gently before giving him a kiss on the cheek. A giggle escaped his mouth before he hugged her tightly, a gesture she wholeheartedly returned. They stayed like this for a moment, none of them saying anything as they hugged one another. Miss Astrid? Harry suddenly asked, sounding really sad. Yes, dear. What will happen to me now? The brown-haired woman blinked as she looked down at him. Without giving her the time to answer, he asked softly. Are you going to leave me at an orphanage? Of course not, sweetheart. You are staying with me. Astrid answered with a grin. Blinking at the unexpected answer, he looked up at her with wide eyes of shock. Really? You mean it? Of course. I have been pretty lonely lately and I won't mind having a cutie like you around, Astrid responded with a warm smile. Harry stared at her with a look of pure disbelief on his face before tears started to fall from his eyes. Concerned, the brown-haired woman opened her mouth to say something only for the tiny child to hug her tightly, his little arms wrapped around her tummy. Smiling warmly at the sobbing boy, she returned the hug while whispering softly in his ear. Welcome to your new life, Harry. I will take care of you, don't worry. The raven-haired child didn't respond as instead he hugged her tighter while enjoying her presence. For the first time in his life, he felt accepted. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 3. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Asian Lionheart 310 on fanfiction.net. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.